All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you guys for joining us for this discussion. Let's start with a brief round of introductions. With you, Brian?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I'm Brian Morgenstern, Head of Public Policy for Riot Platforms. I formerly worked in the Trump administration at the White House and the Treasury Department and on Capitol Hill many, many years ago, and now lead our advocacy efforts at the federal and state level on everything from tax, national security, energy, environment, all the things that impact Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining.
My name is Dr. Marwan Al Zarouni. I'm CEO of AI for Dubai Economy and Tourism. I'm also the CEO of Dubai Blockchain Center.
Matthew Pines, I'm the Director of Intelligence for Pinnacle One, the strategic advisory group of SentinelOne, a cybersecurity company. I advise multinationals on the intersection of geopolitical and cybersecurity risk. My other hat is I'm a National Security Fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, where I examine the intersection of Bitcoin with national security and geopolitics.
And I'm David Zell. I'm the co-founder and co-executive director of the Bitcoin Policy Institute. So, talking about nation-state game theory, I think the reason we're even on a panel with such a title is that in the past few months, there's been a lot more conversation about this notion of Bitcoin as a strategic asset. It's something that we at the think tank have been talking about for a few years now. Obviously, with the sort of rumors that are whirling around the conference with former presidents and high-ranking senators talking about, the potential for the adoption of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, but also more broadly, just talking about Bitcoin as a strategic asset for the United States. I think it's important that we first establish what we mean by that. So I want to ask each of you in turn, why is Bitcoin a strategic asset? For a nation state, what is the utility of the network? So let's start with you, Brian, and go down.
Sure. So the U.S. government owns a lot of assets. It owns a lot of land. It owns a lot of gold bullion. It has a strategic oil reserve, strategic medical supply reserve. There are a lot of reasons why a country would have strategic assets to ensure sort of the strength and resilience of its economy. If you believe, for example, that the U.S. should own gold, and I do, then you should probably make that logical jump to say we should own Bitcoin as well, because Bitcoin is more divisible, more portable. It is a more flexible asset. There has been a lot of talk of tying the U.S. dollar, maybe not going back to a gold standard, but perhaps pegging it to a basket of commodities that could include Bitcoin, gold, platinum, maybe oil, agricultural products, so that the dollar stops inflating away, its value stops inflating away so much, and it's pegged to really, real-world value, things with large markets. And the Bitcoin commodity market is now larger than silver. So I think that it would help strengthen the dollar and strengthen the U.S. economy to have such a reserve. So I'm hopeful that we can continue this conversation with policymakers and that we'll see advances in the coming years.
And you, Dr. Marwan, from your perspective, from a city-state or a nation-state, why is Bitcoin a valuable technology?
So when we looked at Bitcoin back in 2014 as the Dubai government and the UAE government, we looked at the technology, which is blockchain technology. And in 2016, we were one of the first in the world to announce a Bitcoin and blockchain strategy for the country and the city as well. So we started Bitcoin in 2012. Our first event was 2014. Our strategy was 2016 till 2020 for blockchain, to realize every applicable use case using the technology behind Bitcoin, which is blockchain technology, and every applicable use case within the government and also semi-government use cases. So that's within government organization or across different government organizations. And what we realized is there are three value takes from blockchain technology. One is record keeping and notarization, and then as a medium of exchange. And the third one was smart contracts, so programmable money. And this is what we went to market with, and this is what we experimented with until actually we launched our own regulators within the blockchain space, which are VARA, which is Virtual Asset Regulatory Authority, which is a made-for-purpose regulator that does not regulate the underlying asset and categorize that, but rather regulate the activity of the virtual asset service provider.
All right. Well, so sort of two perspectives from two very different parts of the world, two geopolitical actors who have a lot of different incentives and different strategies for navigating the modern age. Matt, why is it that you can have someone who is a former policymaker from the U.S. government, somebody that's here from Dubai, who works closely with the government on technology issues and policy there, arriving at the same conclusion that this asset, this network, provides value to their respective homelands?
Yeah, there's kind of a monetary dynamic and a geopolitical dynamic. And the geopolitical dynamic, I think, as anyone who pays attention to the news will see, is increasingly unstable, increasingly fragmenting. And I think we're on a trajectory where the world is going to increasingly divide up into clubs and fences, both for geopolitical reasons, but also economic reasons, strategic competition around emerging technology, sort of increasing rivalries are driving blocks of nations to wield their power and influence to establish these clubs and fences. And the thing about Bitcoin is Bitcoin doesn't join clubs, doesn't even recognize the existence of those clubs, and it's indifferent to those fences. And so for countries and middle powers looking to sort of establish themselves as sort of neutral players in these increasing sort of strategically competitive global environments, Bitcoin is an attractive proposition because it's fundamentally neutral, right? So if they want to try to play a neutral balancing role in an increasingly competitive system, it's a natural force to try to align with. And I think for the United States in particular, as Brian mentioned, we have been the dominant monetary power for a number of decades, and we sort of structured the system of global trade and the recycling of foreign surpluses that had sort of reinforced the role of the Treasury security as the global reserve asset. And that gave us a lot of sort of endogenous national security and geopolitical power. And I think increasingly, politicians as well as sort of national security decision makers are realizing that has led to serious costs. It's led to the atrophy of our defense industrial base. It has led to sort of imbalance of our economic machine and rise of political instability from the resulting inequality. And so there's I think a recognition that things need to adjust. The question is how does it adjust? And you can have adjustments to those systems in a disruptive fashion or a controlled, planned fashion. I think one of the value propositions of exploring Bitcoin as a strategic reserve is it potentially acts as a hedge and it helps facilitate potential gradual transformation of sort of the basic system. No system lasts forever. The question is, if you transform that system, do you do it in a gradual, controlled, and a deliberate way that accrues power to the United States, where we hold a disproportionate share of Bitcoin in the world. So we're seeing a lot of changes and a lot of disruptions to the existing systems of economics, of sort of geopolitical relations. And Bitcoin, I think, is rising to the geopolitical conversation at that same time. And so naturally, countries are looking to see how it can play a role in aligning with their own national visions for strategic advantage.
Sure. And if we sort of accept that to be true, that countries around the world are looking to this asset and to this network and seeing how they can leverage it to their own benefit, I think we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is that regardless of whether or not people announce sort of landmark public policy or policy intentions over the next 48 hours, it's clear that we are in a sort of historic moment, just by the simple virtue of a former president, a leading contender for the presidency, as well as several senators and high-ranking U.S. public officials who have, as of late, really been beating the Bitcoin drum. I think the implications of that change in signaling alone, this movement from Bitcoin being a sort of speculative trinket or a tool for criminals, but to something that is worthy of serious consideration at the highest levels of government, I think the implications of that are likely profound. And so my next question is, what are the implications geopolitically of a United States, or at the very least a United States with a strong contingent of leaders basically being incredibly bullish about the future of Bitcoin and their country? What kind of dynamics do we expect to materialize from an America that is, forward-facing, bullish on Bitcoin? Do we expect competition among countries? And if so, is that competition zero-sum or positive-sum? So, Brian, let's kick it off to you and go down the same order of panelists.
Well, I think that Bitcoin is doing for money what the internet did for information. And it's going to be critically important if the U.S. wants to maintain its leadership globally to be forward-looking on this. And we're in a moment where that makes the most sense because we've seen excessive money printing and we've seen a lot of inflation recently. And so I think Bitcoin's value proposition is rising rapidly in that conversation. And if the U.S., as sort of the home of global capital, does take a pro-Bitcoin position and really starts to see the value and integrate it more into its economy, then that sort of, I guess it fires the starter's pistol in sort of a new space race, but for this monetary commodity. And I think that there will be tremendous downside risk if other countries don't awaken and start competing, and I think some are already. But that and downside risk, there have been psychological studies that show that loss aversion is an even more powerful motivator than upside potential. And so I do think if the U.S. Takes that position and sort of seizes a first mover advantage, that other countries won't have a choice but to jump into the deep end of the pool with us, which would be great for Bitcoin, for the value of Bitcoin and the utility of the network, and really would show the world that things are changing in a positive way and that they need to get on board lest they be left behind. One example that my friend and colleague Sam Lyman wrote about just in the last day or so was thinking back to like the 1800s. A lot of countries were very focused on gold. China and India kind of veered off into more of a silver standard. They kind of got left behind for decades and had to play catch up. There's probably no perfect analogy to Bitcoin, but that's probably a pretty decent one. So I do think if the U.S. moves, others will have to as well.
And Dr. Marwan, from your perspective, how do you interpret senior U.S. officials and leading politicians embracing Bitcoin? What does it mean for the UAE?
For us in the UAE, especially in Dubai, we don't do politics. So we focus on the value take from the technology. We always are technology focused. We are not focused on what people perceive about the technology. We actually go to market with it. We try regulating it and see what comes from it. And for example, with crypto, when we started regulating crypto and specifically Bitcoin, we realized that there's a lot of learning that has to be happening with the regulators. So we had this continuous feedback loop coming from roundtables, from other engagements with the industry, from opinion papers, regulation kind of ideation with the industry. And from there, we started attracting the biggest exchanges with the biggest VASPs, virtual asset service providers, and literally trying to give them and walk this fine line between regulation, not self-regulation, but an actual regulation that underlines what can be done that protects the customer interests, whether they're retail or institutionals, and as well as make businesses thrive. And Dubai has this mentality of the success of its businesses is what makes it successful. So that way, we are focusing on the success of the business, at the same time preserving the rights and protecting the consumer at the same time. So that way, we get away from all the issues to do with politics. We actually work with countries that embrace blockchain technology and Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and we are not an island. We always work with other countries and and regions that are favoring this kind of technology and embarking and making a bet on this kind of technology. And we're already, after creating the world's first made-for-purpose regulator, we actually started talking to the other crypto-friendly regions to see how we can work together on these initiatives, and what we can learn from them and what we can actually export to them as well.
That makes sense. And, Brian, so does your comment earlier about the Bitcoin network doing for value or money what the internet did for information. And in sort of trying to project or think through what geopolitical competition might look like for the Bitcoin network, I think it's useful to sort of compare it to the internet, right? You have this sort of open protocol that anybody can access and participate in. And in that sense, adoption is non-rivalrous, right? Like the more the merrier. So too with Bitcoin. But there was intense competition in terms of those service providers, right? Some of the largest companies in the world are, early internet businesses that, for a series of reasons, chose to domicile and grow their operations in the United States. And to anyone who's sort of looked at, American, equity markets in the last 30 years, it's clear that we've benefited tremendously from creating, regulatory conditions, among other things, that are, sort of conducive to the running and domiciling of those companies. So, Matt, my question for you is, how can we expect competition vis-a-vis Bitcoin to play out on the international stage? And what sort of form will that competition take?
Yeah, I think you're seeing rising competition across all sorts of domains. So I would characterize as sort of great power network competition. Principally represented not just in Bitcoin and digital assets, but across sort of whole swaths of these emerging, fundamentally digital networks upon which our modern technological civilization relies. And so there is fights over where we lay subsea cables for telecommunications between sort of Western companies, U.S. companies, Chinese companies. What sorts of 5G telecommunication systems get installed in which countries? What sorts of AI cloud service providers and other kind of big data solutions are provided in which countries? Sort of whether sort of Western aligned or China aligned. Companies, what sorts of central bank digital currency networks people are going to opt into or collaborate with in terms of those projects. And so Bitcoin, as it emerges and becomes increasingly geopolitical, is going to be a part of that larger great power network competition, right? Which is a competition not just over strategic influence, right? You're trying to compete over critical nodes in the digital network. You get a lot of power having dominance in a network, right? The U.S. having the dominance in the legacy financial system gave the U.S. immense power by two key parts of network power are essentially surveillance power and choke point power. If you can see all the traffic in a global network, and for example, in financial transactions, you get a lot of useful intelligence out of that, right? So that's essentially FinCEN and sort of the insights we get through SWIFT, and then you can have choke point power vis-a-vis sanctions through OFAC to block and sort of exclude actors from a global network that you dominate. And I think as you see sort of an increasing shift to a more multipolar system and this great power network competition playing out, there's a recognition by all sorts of actors that there's advantages to be gained by positioning yourself as key nodes in these emerging networks, and both mitigating the ability for you to be constrained by another stakeholder or in the global system that has lots of power, but also gives you lots of strategic autonomy. And so I think Bitcoin will be a part of that dynamic and will be looked to as a way for lots of countries to sort of preserve some of that strategic autonomy. And in particular, from the perspective of the United States, there are, this isn't just raw power dynamics. There are sort of, implicit value systems embedded in all technology. And so there are certain visions of emerging technological governance which are fundamentally kind of digital authoritarian based, right? This is about increasing control and surveillance of populations using these tools and, essentially governing them vis-a-vis their interaction with digital systems that the government and the ruling systems control and can sort of suppress dissent, can sort of lead to potentially bad outcomes for human rights. And so there is a competition playing out at that level too, and to the extent that Bitcoin is sort of a fundamentally open, organic, bottom-up adopted digital system that is fundamentally premised on giving individuals access to and control over their own property and the ability to engage peer-to-peer in speech and exchange, that represents a kind of a global technology that can support essentially digital liberalism and potentially a counterbalancing force against what would otherwise be maybe a powerful convergence towards digital authoritarianism. So to the extent that the United States and sort of like-minded countries are interested in kind of fostering innovation, economic development, and sort of liberal human rights, like the Bitcoin's adoption, as well as other related technologies, I think will be aligned with our national interests.
So, Dr. Marwan, as the United States tries to position itself as a critical node in this great power network competition that Matthew describes, you talked to me backstage about policy decisions that you were involved in many years ago. What, if any, lessons do you think American policymakers could learn from Dubai's regulatory treatment of Bitcoin?
I think approaching any kind of new asset class with a blank sheet of paper, trying to see and understand. I think first thing is education. You really need to understand what is the underlying underlying asset, what is the technology that enables it, how does it work under the hood, and from there try to design something that not only tries to cater for this technology, but how it can make it actually thrive, and how can you, as a region or as a catalyst, make that technology work for the best. What is the value take from that technology? Identify that, play around with it, have a really fast feedback loop with the industry, as well as all the participants, from retail to institutionals and others, just to make sure that when you are actually moving within the space, you are actually the fastest mover, you are breaking things, and that's okay, actually, totally okay, and you're not polarizing anybody in that space.
Yeah.
You want to play and encourage the good players, and you want to really make it extremely hard for the bad players to flourish.
That makes sense. So, Brian, from your perspective, and we are closing up on time here, what would your elevator pitch be to American policymakers? What are the most critical changes needed for America to come out on top in this great power network competition?
So some of what Dr. Marwan said, I really appreciated. Approaching this from a tech-neutral perspective, helping businesses thrive, not trying to shoehorn new things into old frameworks. I jokingly said if he's interested in running for office in Texas, we'd love to talk to him about that, because that's the sort of pro-business, pro-human thriving, innovation attitude I think I'd like to see from our policymakers. And there are different attitudes from different government entities in the U.S., and I kind of joke about this when people ask what's the biggest difference between, we have a lot of operations in Texas, we also deal with federal regulation. When I come to Washington, the question is usually, why should we let you do this? And then I go to Texas and it's, how can we help? Right? So I think the U.S. needs to be leaning more in that latter direction, rather than having regulators sort of struggling to get their piece of the territory, which often can happen. I do think, when I was at Treasury, where we worked on the concept of regulatory sandboxes and allowing new ideas to thrive, and not always just assuming the worst or looking first at risks, but you also have to look at the benefits. So sort of an attitude shift, and then there are downstream policies from that. We've seen a lot of hostility from the SEC here in the U.S. We had litigation against the Energy Department. Banking regulators have been a little bit difficult for the industry. So I think that attitude shift, broadly based across government entities, would be very helpful for positioning the U.S. to win this competition going forward.
That makes sense. So let's go to closing thoughts, starting with you, Dr. Marwan.
So I encourage everyone here to actually take that leap of faith and really come to Dubai and experience Dubai firsthand, and experience how the crypto industry is doing there, how Bitcoin mining is done there, how everything to do with this space, with technology in general. And the best place to come to Dubai is actually in October, We have the world's biggest tech conference called GITEX, Gulf Information Technology Exhibition, as well as Future Blockchain Summit, where we do not talk about how crypto is right now, but how do we perceive crypto in the next 10 years. So you owe it to yourself to come to Dubai, you owe it to yourself to come in October this year and experience this firsthand, not through hearsay, but through you experiencing it and really coming to the where thought leaders within this tech space, not only with crypto, but crypto intersection with AI, intersection with big tech, come together to talk and really rub shoulders against thought leaders within the space.
All right, Brian?
Sure. We've made tremendous progress in recent years. It wasn't long ago that President Trump and other policymakers were calling Bitcoin a scam and saying mean things about it. And now all of a sudden, we've done a lot of work. The industry has matured quite a bit, and we've done a lot of work, and you and Matthew, of course, included, in educating policymakers on the potential of Bitcoin and the Bitcoin network. So things are getting better every single day, and I think they will continue to do that. And the fact that we're even having this conversation in this beautiful conference about a potential strategic reserve is a signal that we've come a long way. We still have a long way to go, but we're making tremendous progress.
All right, Matt, you've got a few minutes for some closing thoughts here.
Yeah, I would say, Americans, we tend to look inwards, and we tend to think that basically the rest of the world doesn't matter, and that our political disputes will basically dominate, the rest of the world. And to the extent, because we are the global hegemon, it does matter, our political debates. But to the extent that Bitcoin becomes politicized in the frame of U.S. politics, that's not relevant to the rest of the world. And Bitcoin is a fundamentally global phenomenon. And so, as Dr. Marwan was saying, they don't think about Bitcoin as a political thing. They don't think about it as, aligned or coded as being a Republican or a right-wing or a liberal thing. It's just a thing that has certain attributes and gives them certain advantages. And so, if you really want to contextualize Bitcoin's role in the next few years, I think you have to really step out of the sort of narrow frame of U.S. politics and think about how folks in Beijing, how folks in Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, and other capitals around the world that are not necessarily bound by the same sorts of debates and constraints that we have inside this country. And Bitcoin is a global phenomenon, and it will evolve in ways that no single power can fully steer. And so, to the extent that we turn inwards and forget about these other global actors, we may give up what could be a strong advantage for us. And so it behooves policymakers on both sides of the aisle to actually step out of any particular tribal affiliation and think about the global landscape, how it might change, and how it could change pretty radically, and the agency that other key stakeholders and power centers around the world have to leverage Bitcoin in ways that could get the jump on the United States. And so I think we see positive signs of this more recently, but it has to carry momentum. It has to actually be executed.
All right. Well, Brian, Dr. Marwan, Matt, thank you all for your time. And Dr. Marwan, I look forward to seeing you in October.
100%.
All right. Thank you all.
The Bitcoin Conference. We started with a dream to build a community focused on Bitcoin. It all started in 2019 in the heart of San Francisco, the first major Bitcoin conference in years that kickstarted a revolution. And then Miami, a place where enthusiasts, developers, dreamers, and innovators could come together to make Bitcoin better. It has been an amazing 5 years and 8 conferences, thanks to all of you. Bitcoin Conference has become the largest premier global Bitcoin gathering in the world, leading hyper-Bitcoinization. While Miami was incredible, it was time to set the stage for Bitcoin in a new city. So we took the conference on the road. Nashville, Tennessee was the obvious choice, a city known for music and freedom. Next year, the conference is hitting the road again in search of the next global stage. We are headed to a new city next year. With hyper-Bitcoinization right around the corner, we have no plans to take the foot off the gas. Find out where we are headed next. Scan the QR code and be at the main stage for the big announcement.